Here lies an honest man, my brothers, who raised himself by raising others. Anxious his friends from soil to save, his converse still was with the grave. To rescue from the tomb his mission, he took men off to the physician, and strove that all whom death releases should rest, if not in peace, in pieces. So here he waits his resurrection, in hopes his life may bear dissection. We often take for granted how much anatomical knowledge we hold today. When you see a doctor or get surgery done, you can trust that your doctor most likely knows what organs you've got floating around in there, what may be wrong, and how to fix it. But knowledge like this comes with an incredibly fraught history, one filled with scandal, secrecy, racism, and murder most foul. This was a well-documented problem in the US, France, etc., but nowhere is it more famous than in the UK. As I meandered my way through Edinburgh and London, the signs of it were everywhere, the everlasting cultural memory of body snatching in the name of science. Because the world of medicine leading up to and during the Industrial Revolution was an incredibly fraught place. Hospitals were notoriously unclean and rife with infection, leading to them being dubbed houses of death. Doctors saw blood and gore as symbols of pride, walking around with blood-stained aprons on, laughing about good old hospital stink. Due to the lack of cleanliness and an insufficient knowledge of the body's workings, surgery was an extremely rare occurrence and often reserved for amputations, which needed to be done very quickly because the patient was awake and numbed most likely only with alcohol or laudanum or other extreme drugs, and doctors were highly aware of the issue and knew that they needed further study of the body to try and figure out what was causing these issues in the first place. With germ theory still on the horizon but distant, doctors sought out the bodies of the dead to dissect and improve anatomical knowledge, and they'd go to great lengths to get them, hiring desperate men to do it, or doing the deed themselves. Most body snatchers or resurrectionists or resurrection men didn't actually murder people, unlike some. They would dig up the graves of the recently deceased and get their supply that way. But it's still a case of morbid supply and demand. Doctors needed bodies to study, and the resurrectionists needed money. Both situations put people in a prime spot to commit awful atrocities in the name of science and survival. And the dead are no longer alive to suffer, right? Come learn with me. Side note, if discussions of murder, anatomy, gore, and such make you squeamish, that one's kind of unavoidable in this one. I won't have any images on screen of anything especially disturbing, of course, but I just want you to be aware. So, with that said, let's get into it. But first, a quick word from today's sponsor, Aura. These days, you have literally no idea just how much your personal data is floating around on the internet, easily accessible to anyone looking to mess with you. Data brokers sell your information to scammers, spammers, and basically anybody with Wi-Fi, giving them full and cheap access to your full name, email, home address, health records, your relatives, etc. And that's why I'm so glad that I've been using Aura, which shows me which data brokers are selling my information, and it automatically submits opt-out requests for me. Before I started using Aura, I searched my name and was shocked by how much personal info came up on numerous websites, which was so uncomfortable and anxiety-inducing. Since getting my info cleaned out, I've gotten a lot less spam, and it protects me from hackers who could use this information to get into my social media accounts, bank accounts, and more. You also get other features like antivirus, VPN, password management, identity theft insurance, and more without having to download several different apps. It's all easily manageable and intuitive, all in one spot for a really affordable price. Also, you may have heard that AT&T revealed that over 73 million customer records, both existing and former customers, were released on the dark web. Of course, they recommend that those affected use strong passwords, monitor account activity, and consider credit freezes or fraud alerts from credit bureaus, but luckily Aura does all of that, and I don't have to download several different new apps just because a company couldn't keep my data secure. With Aura's all-encompassing protection, you can rest assured that you're protected on all ends of the interweb experience and save yourself future grief by getting your your personal information away from prying eyes. I value my privacy, and I value yours. You can go to aura.com/Casro to start your 2-week free trial, also linked below in the description. Thank you so much to Aura for sponsoring this video, and now let's get back to learning about ye olde resurrection men. For as long as humans have had bodies, we have wanted to know what this thing's got rattling around in there. Why my head hurt? Where food go? How legs move? When did plankton get in there? For centuries, all these questions were wrapped up in the great moral quandary, trapped in between the need for knowledge and the seemingly impossible way to get that knowledge without doing great harm. At the same time, what actually qualifies as harm in the pursuit of knowledge is something that has changed quite a lot over time. But obviously that wasn't going to stop curious early scientists from taking it upon themselves to figure out the secrets of the human body. Of course, we knew it was possible that our inner stuff was similar to other mammals, and by way of eating animals, people knew pretty much everything there was to know about them. And because war and crime is an ancient issue, people had always, sadly, been exposed to the sight of mangled corpses on battlefields, often with their organs spilling out. Or even simply if someone got into an accident or was attacked. In order to help people, you had to know more about the body, and that requires up-close and personal study of corpses. The first known person to systematically dissect a body was Herophilus in Alexandria in 335 BC. We don't know much about this guy since a lot of writings on him were lost in one of the fires at the Library of Alexandria. Go watch my video about that before you go to the comments complaining about it. But it's likely that Herophilus and his contemporaries were allowed to do this because in a short span of time in ancient Greece, a lot of people believed that the soul disappears after you die. So for a while it made sense that dissecting the body was doing no harm. But in the 3rd century BC, anatomical dissection was made firmly illegal in Greece. People began thinking that the corpse was the cause of public disease, and that if a corpse is desecrated, a person's soul will not find peace. This idea is carried down from ancient Egyptian beliefs about the post-mortem body, where the soul can't reach the afterlife unless the body is properly prepared, embalmed, and entombed. These ideas in large part stuck around for millennia, causing people to rely on dissectionless forms of anatomical study, and this meant taking advantage of pre-existing injury. For example, in the 100s AD, Galen would study the extreme injuries of gladiators, being their physician. He compared his human studies to more in-depth dissections of animals like pigs and monkeys, findings that would impact human medicine for many, many years, just kinda assuming that human guts are probably the same as animal guts. You really can't fault him too much because honestly he was doing a better job than Pliny the Elder, at least. Sorry, Pliny. Things wouldn't really get shaken up all that much until the year 1231, when Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II passed a decree saying, well, fine, you guys can dissect bodies, but only one body every 5 years. And then in 1315, the Italian doctor Mondino de Luzzi did a public dissection of a criminal's body, as the anatomy game had been shifting slowly over time, because, let's be real, people couldn't advance medical study without it, and also, people are genuinely just morbidly curious. The so-called Age of Enlightenment was on the horizon, and Europeans were eager to shake up society in pursuit of knowledge. Because, oh yeah, this little silly thing that just happened, you may not have heard of it. It's called the bubonic plague. The Black Death, as it was called, took out 1/3 of Europe's population. It was such a massive swell of death, it effectively ended feudalism in many countries. And the plague also made it really clear to people just how little they actually knew about disease in the human body, how powerless they felt. Mind you, the plague actually went away and came back in waves several times, so it truly felt inescapable. I know we know what that's like. And people, I should specify, Christians, during the plague were getting up to all sorts of antics trying to avoid or cure it. They killed people, ate poop, hid in the sewers, developed spicy new rituals, etc., none of which worked, of course. And when educational dissections started becoming more common, they were still so wrapped up in Galen's teachings that it actually stood as a roadblock to progress. During dissections, a teacher would read out Galen's writings, and if students saw anything that contradicted Galen, they'd be like, oh, looks like this dead guy was either majorly sinful or just physically fucked up. Which of course was an easy assumption to make when all of the cadavers you're dissecting are criminals. Things really made a big shift in 1543 when De Humani Corporis Fabrica by Andreas Vesalius was published. This anatomical textbook, filled with detailed illustrations, followed the tradition kept previously by Leonardo da Vinci, who was an artist interested in anatomical dissection, not a doctor. Both Da Vinci and Vesalius' work helped promote the acceptance of anatomy as a worthwhile and valid field of study, leading to King Henry VIII legalizing dissection of criminals in England. With this, the field of medicine began evolving more than ever and much faster. With the development of organized medical schools and the increasing frequency of surgery, you started seeing surgeries taking place in rooms like this operating theatre in the Surgeons' Hall Museum, Edinburgh, or, even more accurately, the Old Operating Theatre in London. The Old Operating Theatre is one of my favorite places that I went in London because it's so thoroughly unchanged and lovingly restored. You have to climb up this unbelievably narrow and very tall spiral staircase to get in, which opens up into this magnificent apothecary and pharmacy. When I was there, they had a jar of live leeches, which was pretty cool. And then, of course, there's the operating theatre itself. Medical students visiting doctors and sometimes even members of the public would stand in the risers here, watching as a teacher below demonstrated dissecting a body on the table or performing a surgery, most often an amputation. Imagine going in for a surgery today knowing you'll be awake the entire time with no antiseptic or functional painkiller to get your leg sawed off in front of an oogling crowd. It's nuts, right? You can go watch my video on Victorian medicine to learn more about that, as well as the famous Dr. Robert Liston, who actually did his own resurrecting to get cadavers rather than outsourcing that labor. Surgery as a whole wouldn't improve in the whole pain and horrors department until the development of anesthesia using ether and Joseph Lister's development of antiseptic practices, all of which you can learn more about by reading The Butchering Art by Dr. Lindsey Fitzharris. But all of that, of course, exacerbates the main issue. With the demand for study cadavers rising, using only the bodies of criminals could hardly support the demand. Doctors were simply going to need to find their own corpse supply somewhere else. Like, fresh from the cemetery, perhaps? Well, I guess it's true that grave robbing in general was nothing new. For time eternal, human beings have been laid to rest with items they found special in life. Jewelry, dolls, clothing, tools, other personal effects. Royalty often were entombed with great riches and treasures, attracting hordes of thieves cleaning the places out, if they could locate the tombs in the first place. But really, no one had an interest in stealing the bodies, because they weren't worth anything. Not yet, anyway. As soon as a black market industry of cadaver selling developed in the wake of legalized dissection, things began to spiral out of control. And quickly. A body could earn you a pretty penny in the 18th and 19th centuries, running anywhere from 10 to 20 Great British pounds, which is a couple $1,000 these days. And even more if you had a unique physical condition on your hands. Extreme growths, dwarfism, deformities, conjoined limbs, anything that would help with study and look neat in a physician's personal collection of curiosities. These collections had been growing in popularity for centuries, but by the 18th century, they had become huge status symbols. Doctors and even just gentlemen with a morbid curiosity curated museum-level collections of organic specimens and human remains, along with taxidermy and other grotesque oddities. These gentlemen collectors and wealthy doctors, with more cash to throw around, drove body prices up for not just unique corpses, but regular ones too. Some bodies earning their sellers £500 to £700, or $65,000 to $91,000 today. On the less morally abhorrent end of the spectrum, people started auctioning off their own corpses to the highest bidder even before they died. But other incidents had people turning on each other for a quick buck. One criminal named Maggie Dixon was hanged at the gallows, and her family launched a physical altercation with a number of people who wanted to sell her body for dissection. Luckily for Maggie and her family, she somehow managed to survive being hanged and was allowed to walk away free since, well, she had already been punished. But you can see, with the prices floating around, why desperate people low on cash would throw hands over a fresh corpse, especially in places like Scotland, where the top surgeons and anatomists were. And the chances of people actually getting convicted of a crime for stealing corpses was fairly low because the dead body technically didn't count as property. So these body snatchers looking to sell corpses developed an organized trade. They'd keep track of burials, often those of the poor, and in the dead of night they would enter the cemetery, dig up the corpse, remove the clothing and valuables so they couldn't be accused of stealing property, and haul the body to a hospital or medical school where they would be paid for their grim services. If you watched season 2 of Good Omens, you probably remember the episode with the comical scene set in Edinburgh that references the body trade when Crowley and Aziraphale follow a poor Scottish girl named Elspeth who is trying to sell bodies to survive. This episode is actually really interesting because it sums up the moral quandary of body snatching in the first place. Elspeth and her friend Morag are living on the streets and desperate, and Elspeth argues that the dead are dead. They can't suffer anymore, but the living can.
Well, it's wrong.
He's not using it anymore. There's something for his family to cry over.
So who is it really harming to sell them for money so the living can eat? So the doctors can learn more about medicine and save lives. Aziraphale argues that it's still immoral, but changes his mind when the surgeon, Dr. Dalrymple, explains why he does what he does. Back in the cemetery, Morag is tragically killed by a booby-trap gun set on a grave to protect the body from Bodysnatchers, and Elspeth resolves to sell Morag's body instead. While played as comedic and overall intended to be an example of the demon Crowley's secretly kind heart, it's a wholly accurate display of the sorts of suffering and ethically nuanced issues at play here. Real-life body snatchers, who would then be dubbed Resurrectionists or Resurrection Men, were often people like Elspeth, who genuinely needed money. And when you're that desperate, your worldview shifts. The unbearably poor don't often have the same luxury of viewing the dead the same as the well-off do. But, of course, this field of work didn't just attract the earnest and desperate. It also attracted characters of a more dark nature. When I was in Edinburgh, one of the main things I noticed was the omnipresent shadow of two notable names: Burke and Hare. First, I spotted it on this strip club near the bookstores I was perusing, and then on this pet accessories vendor at a market named after them. Edinburgh, in a grim way, loves Burke and Hare, but who were they, anyway? William Burke and William Hare were the resurrection men who sold bodies to the incredibly famous physician, Dr. Robert Knox, one of the highest-paying anatomists of the era. Burke and Hare were strapped for cash, and one day someone who was lodging with Hare passed away. When trying to figure out what to do with the body, Burke had an idea. They should sell it to Robert Knox, and at least get some cash out of it. So they did. And then they kept doing it because another person living in the building became ill, and Hare was instantly paranoid that his business would go to shit if the public found out he had sick lodgers. So Burke and Hare murdered her, and Knox got another body. By this point, the two men figured that they couldn't turn back now, and Knox didn't really seem to care where they got the bodies from, so the pair took to the darkness of the foggy Edinburgh night, scouring the streets for victims, killing them and taking their bodies to Dr. Robert Knox. This continued for far too long, and only stopped when one day, during one of Knox's dissections, one of the onlookers at the operating theater recognized the body on the table, and the whole scheme fell apart, leading to a massive media scandal that shed light on the dubious industry of resurrectionists. The Burke and Hare case was so famous and influential that body snatching afterwards was often dubbed Burking. Not all resurrectionists were murderers, though, and not all were regular men. Many resurrectionists were actually medical students themselves, because students who provided cadavers to their professors often got their school fees forgiven. But many of these students weren't as street savvy as regular body snatchers were, and often found themselves in an awkward position, realizing that they had just dug up a corpse and now had absolutely no idea how to get it back to school. So they had very few options, many of which ended up gruesomely comical. Many would try to hail a cab, which was still horse-drawn coaches in those days, and hope that the driver didn't ask too many questions. Unfortunately for these students, the drivers often knew exactly what they were up to, and would simply drop their asses off at the police station. Other students avoided this risk by organizing their own transport, and one famous story involves a few students who basically pulled off like a Weekend at Bernie's style scheme by sitting the corpse up in between them in the carriage and pretending it was their sick friend, talking to the body like, "Don't worry, man, hang in there, we'll be home soon and we'll get you some breakfast on the high street." The toll keeper, who everyone knew hated resurrectionists, shone his lantern on the sick friend and was like, "Oh, he looks like shit." Of course, all the body snatching didn't stay a secret industry for very long. Families began to become very concerned about their recently departed loved ones ending up on an operating theater table, being taken apart by those dastardly medical men. I mean, it truly is a horrendous thought when there's no consent involved. So it's no wonder that people started coming up with ideas for how to protect bodies until they were decomposed enough to be undesirable to doctors. One option was to hold watch parties in cemeteries where people's families and friends would take watches at the graveyards at night. Unfortunately, people also tended to get very drunk at these parties and fall asleep, so some bodies got snatched anyway. Other families would hire armed guards to watch the new graves, which also resulted in incidents. Some resurrectionists, often students, would get shot and killed by these guards, resulting in their friends selling their bodies instead. Other families went into Home Alone level booby trap territory, like the one that was shown in Good Omens. One father allegedly rigged a bomb onto the coffin of his deceased son that would go off if disturbed. Sometimes methods were done to make the body undesirable to resurrectionists, like pouring pitch or lime onto the grave to make the body rot faster. Still, other families took the simpler and more obvious route, mort safes, like the one seen here in Greyfriars Kirkyard in Edinburgh. As I discussed in my video on real-life vampire hunting, you've probably seen these cages around the internet labeled like vampire containment devices. Cages put over graves to keep the vampires inside. No, that's not what they're for. They were to keep body snatchers out, and were often removed once the body was decomposed enough, but many, like these ones, just kinda stayed put, leaving a grim reminder of a dark past. But these preventative measures could only do so much, especially in the face of such high demand and an increasingly deep-rooted black market industry. The Hunter brothers of London, William and John, followed what was called the Paris manner, or a method of teaching anatomy where each student had their own body to dissect. So, of course, their demand was higher. As a result, William had his students go assist the body snatching and bribe the sextons at the church to leave the gates open, and John would personally negotiate with the scary dudes of the London underworld to assist in their trade. But not everyone was so successful, and even the getaway drivers could be punished. One coachman in 1797, named Samuel Taylor, was caught transporting corpses from Old Street Road's burial ground in London with a number of bodies in the trunk of his coach. The parish watch tossed Samuel into the trunk along with the bodies so they could transport him to the Clerkenwell prison in his own coach. But upon arriving, they opened the trunk and found that Samuel had fallen asleep alongside the bodies for a nice little nap, and they actually struggled to wake him up. One particularly egregious body snatching scandal in 1795 didn't even benefit scientific progress. The 15-man gang found digging up bodies of children in Lambeth's graveyard were preparing to send the bodies overseas to the Americas and the West Indies, where the skulls were turned into nail boxes, and one man of the gang even gave one of the skeletons to his child as a toy. So as you can imagine, people were pretty fucking pissed about all of this going on. In 1725, an angry mob went to Surgeons' Hall in Edinburgh, threatening to raid the place after it was discovered that the students of Alexander Monroe had been body snatching. Another Edinburgh riot in 1742 led to the burning down of Resurrection Hall, the home of beadle George Haldane, after the surgeon Martin Eccles and his students stole a body from St. Cuthbert's Kirkyard. All through the next 2 nights, surgeons' homes were attacked and Eccles' shop was ransacked. Through the rest of the month, the mob continued attacking the homes of people suspected to be resurrectionists, but only one person faced actual official punishment when all was over: John Samuel, who had been discovered trying to escape the city with a child's cadaver. He was whipped through the Edinburgh streets and then exiled from Scotland for 7 years. I mean, despite the obvious horror of disturbing and desecrating the bodies of the dead, people were also pissed that the doctors and medical students weren't even being respectful about it and often were obliquely offensive. The desensitization of medical men to the corpse often led to students using these bodies in pranks, dressing them up, hiding them in places to startle people, posing with them for goofy photos, or worse, waving them around in view of windows to scare local children. So, due to potential backlash and understandable taboo of the whole situation, doctors ended up working in relative secrecy and, well, disposing of dissected remains in less than honorable ways. You may remember a news story from a few years ago when human remains were discovered here at Benjamin Franklin's home in London, in the basement. For a while there, people freaked out and were wildly speculating, was Benjamin Franklin a serial killer? Well, as it turns out, no. Ben Franklin had allowed a doctor to use his basement in secret for anatomical dissection, and, like many others, the remains had simply been dumped there and forgotten. Another recent incident occurred at the former London Hospital, now known as the Royal London Hospital, which was founded in 1740 and served the poor residents of the East End. In 2006, when the hospital expanded and archaeologists investigated the surrounding areas, an old forgotten burial ground was uncovered. Over 262 undocumented remains were found jumbled together, many of the bodies incomplete. Many bones were marred by saw and knife marks, others contained obvious signs of autopsy or holes in skulls from practicing trepanning. And despite the decrees that followed public outrage that demanded these bodies were buried respectfully, they were still effectively dumped in mass graves. Resurrectionists themselves, the professional ones that is, also became very good at covertly transporting bodies and digging them up quickly and efficiently without getting caught. By the early to mid-19th century, the resurrectionists were very skilled at what they did, but it made it no less grotesque. They developed a mail-order system that allowed surgeons to order bodies from far away in England or Ireland, meaning less chance that they'd be connected to upset local families or have another incident where someone recognizes the body being dissected. Bodies would be chilled, stuffed into barrels, trunks, and boxes, wrapped in sacks filled with perfumes, and labeled produce. Even worse, it needs to be noted that almost all targeted bodies were the poorer classes, and very frequently the bodies of people of color, because people knew that these bodies were less likely to be protected, both in the graveyard and by the law. Aya Nuruddin and Graham Mooney write in The Art of Medicine for The Lancet, since 1619, when the first enslaved people were brought to the British colony of Virginia, until June 19, 1865, when the last enslaved black person was emancipated in the USA, black people, and especially black women, endured violent medical treatment and experimentation against their will. Enslaved black people's bodies were exploited for the development of some aspects of U.S. medical education in the 19th century. Medical schools relied on enslaved black bodies as anatomical material, and recruited students in southern states by advertising its abundance. This practice was widespread in the 19th and early 20th centuries. American medical education relied on the theft, dissection, and display of bodies, many of whom were black. The Virginia Medical College, for example, employed a black man named Chris Baker as its resurrectionist to steal freshly buried black bodies to use for dissection. Baker was the resurrectionist from the 1880s until his death in 1919. To this day, obviously, medical racism persists in a number of ways, from patients of color not being taken seriously, or believed, or prescribed the proper medication, or given tests they need, to the persistent belief that black patients don't feel as much pain as white patients do, that their skin is quite literally thicker. Black patients, both dead and alive, throughout history were used as convenient medical experiment subjects without consent. For example, when Henrietta Lacks died of cervical cancer in 1951, her unusual cancer cells were taken without the knowledge of her and her family to create the Hellas cell line that has been the basis of cancer cell study ever since. So, of course, the whole system was absolutely fucked, and still is to a certain extent. How did we move past the need for resurrection men, though? The Anatomy Act of 1832 changed a lot of things. When Burke and Hare were caught, Hare confessed and sold out Burke to the authorities, which ended with Burke being hung and, fittingly, dissected. His body was, I guess, put to use. In the University of Edinburgh Anatomical Museum, which I unfortunately didn't get to see, Burke's skeleton is still on display. As for Hare, no one's really certain of his fate. He absconded from Scotland and disappeared into the shadows of history, although most legends claim that he died a blind beggar on the streets of London. After the Burke and Hare case, people were so aware of the problem and so upset that officials were forced to change the rules and pass the act to make it easier for surgeons to attain bodies for education through more legal means. It said that those teaching anatomy needed to get an official license, and those with a license could dissect obtained bodies that were unclaimed. Still, usually the bodies of the poor or immigrants. But it also stipulated that people could donate their next of kin's bodies on the condition that they would be properly buried afterward at the school's expense. The act faced great backlash from the public, but still resulted in a shift in the public's mindset as to the criminality and sinfulness of dissected bodies, and the way people thought about science in general. And as the conditions in hospitals improved, alongside the development of antiseptics by Joseph Lister, germ theory by Louis Pasteur, and the expanded use of anesthesia, people started fearing hospitals and medical men a lot less. Slowly, very painfully, things began to improve. But speaking of anesthesia, some of you may follow my wonderful friend Christine, aka Sostine, who does some amazing historical sewing here on YouTube, as well as on Instagram. In addition to her sewing skills, though, Christine is a working anesthesiologist, so she has first-hand experience with modern medical school and, of course, dissecting a cadaver. I sat down with Christine to get a better idea of what that was like and what issues we still face today. So, this is Christine Sostine, who has her own channel on YouTube, which I have linked below, and you should definitely check it out because she is amazing at historical sewing. But Christine is also literally an anesthesiologist, a working doctor, so she has first-hand experience with modern day medical school and working with cadavers in that environment.
Hi, I'm Christine. So I went to NYU Medical School. I was there for 4 years, and I feel really old saying that, from 2008 to 2012. And at that time, there was Cadaver Lab. They still have Cadaver Lab at that campus as well. And Cadaver Lab is a 3-month course. It's actually tied into anatomy and physiology of the courses. So the idea behind that is that the medical students would first read about the body, study it, and every single day for about 2 hours, we would go and we'd actually dissect out whatever we read about that day. So it could be the little bit of the hand, this little bit of the arm, or this little bit over here. And we actually worked in really small segments so that we would learn all about what we had read about earlier that day and had a lecture on. So it all tied together, and it was actually a really important and formative experience for me as a physician.
So when you guys were going into working with the cadavers in medical school, were you given any sort of introduction as to like who this person was, or was it more of an anonymous thing? And also, did you have any idea of how the school acquired the cadavers?
So first off, they were anonymous to us. And moreover, what we were told was that this was someone who had voluntarily donated the bodies and that they did it very willingly. And the other thing that we were told is that they died somewhere between 6 months and a year before, because they pickle them for a really long time before they bring them over to us. So this is not a freshly deceased person. And by the time we get them, they really are very pickled. And in some ways, I think they tried really hard to take away the humanity of the situation so that less people would faint, really. So when we were working on the arm, the rest of the body would be covered. We would only have the arm out and so forth. And I actually did still pass out during.
Oh no!
I actually passed out twice in cadaver lab. But a lot of people did. It's actually there's this very visceral moment when you're working with the dead, when you're like, oh my God, this is a real person with real memories. Everything that they felt and loved is in this body right here. And it was also a really meaningful experience. I can still tell you the 3 other members of my cadaver lab who were with me, because it was 4 of us per body, because we went through something so important together. Up to that point, like, you're studying books. You studied books in high school. You studied books in college. That moment really does solidify it. This is someone who donated their bodies, and we were so grateful to them. I remember we kept on saying, oh my God, like, that's so nice of them. Would we ever donate our bodies? And you know, it's really funny. Back then I was like, I would never donate. And now I'm like, I probably would. Why not? I remember Dr. Bogart, who taught the course, he told us, you know, that he would go to these nursing homes to talk to people who wanted to donate their bodies. And he said that what he noticed hanging out with these people were that they were really kind of in some ways excited to be part of our education. He would say that they would sit around their tables at the nursing home talking about, oh, I bet they're going to get a kick when they discover my arthritis here, or the fact that I don't have this pancreas here, or there's a gallbladder scar here. And, you know, they have a very different view of death. And he was telling me that as people got older, they saw it as a way of giving back.
Such an interestingly different experience people are having now compared to like back in the Victorian period, when people saw it as a sign that you were either going to be like doomed in the afterlife, or a criminal, or like a sinner if you were being dissected by these anatomists, even though a lot of these people whose bodies are being snatched, it wasn't their fault. They weren't legally being dissected. So when you were in medical school, did your professors ever get into the history of cadaver study at all, and like how things used to be?
You know, they really don't talk about the history of medicine that much, and I actually find that to be such a pity. At least maybe they do now, but they did not back then. And I think that's such a pity, because the way that we got here is honestly kind of a treacherous road. Like, when I think about the history of anesthesia and how much non-consent there was there and abuse of power, but it's very kept clean, and moreover, they try to keep it as respectful as humanly possible to the bodies.
When you guys were studying these cadavers, were you aware of how the school disposes of the bodies, or was that like not even a thing you guys were let in on?
We were told that, you know, in exchange for donating the bodies, no one got paid or anything. However, they did get free cremation if requested. So after the bodies were pickled for somewhere between 6 months to a year, and then the 3 months of the course, what they would do is they would then like message the families back and say, hi, would you like the bodies back? And sometimes they'd say yes, but more often than not, they'd say, please dispose of it, because the agreement with NYU was that they would dispose of the bodies in a respectful manner. And that's what we were told. There was a scandal, and I want to emphasize that I believe this is a was, because I think they fixed it since then. But it really, really upset me and my fellow students. Actually, when we found out, we actually called each other up and like, did you read about this? Oh my God. And what it turns out they did is, instead of actually cremating these bodies and disposing of the ashes in a respectful manner, what they were doing is they were literally just like having them brought to a mass grave in a dump somewhere. And it was honestly really heartbreaking, because, you know, that's not what the volunteers signed up for. Consent is at the very heart of medicine. Like, everything we do in healthcare, I say this repeatedly, like sticking people, stealing their blood, injecting them with other people's blood, like taking out organs like gallbladders and surgery, all anesthesia, all of this is just abuse without consent. The moment you don't consent to any medical procedure, it's just absolute abuse, and there's no way to go around it. So consent is literally at the heart of all of medicine.
Yeah, and that includes what happens to the bodies that people study. And that's like so upsetting that you know, the same thing that was happening at these old Victorian hospitals like still happened so recently.
At the very end of the course, we have a memorial service for the cadavers, and we all get together and, you know, we write poems, we write notes of thank you. I wrote a letter, and you know, people bring flowers, and we like put them on top of our bodies, and we say thank you, and we go around in a circle and talk about how grateful we are to the person who donated their body. And then to hear that after that they just carted them off to a dump, like, and you know, my class was in the years where this was happening, so this happened to our body too, probably.
So how would you say that you feel about the way that cadaver study is slowly evolving and changing? Because clearly, like, we're getting to an era where technology is sort of taking over in a lot of respects.
So first off, when I was in medical school back in the day, cadaver study was not optional. It was actually necessary. As far as I know, there was no medical school that did not have cadaver lab. And I heard stories of students who would enroll in medical school and have to drop out for religious reasons because they could not touch a dead body. I remember thinking, oh, that's really like tragic. At the same time, I personally learned so much from cadaver lab, and my understanding of anatomy has been so closely tied to the cadaver that I worked with, and that I can't really imagine not learning without it. But that being said, you know, technology is wonderful. Some medical schools have done away with cadaver lab, and they're doing solely AI or like, you know, computer generated and simulation lab. And I don't know how good it is. I've never tried it, and I'm not going to be someone who's like, no, my way is the only way. Maybe there's a better way, but at the same time, I will say that for me, it was a very essential experience. Even the best textbook, and I think that everyone's unanimously agreed that Netter's Anatomy is considered the best guide. And that's what we learned with. And, you know, even then, all it does is it shows you the average, because not every body has a vein going in exactly the same place. Right. And some people don't have this certain vein and they have another one. But textbooks don't show you all the different variations. And the nice thing about cadaver lab is when you're dissecting that cadaver, you see how it's supposed to be on a computer simulation or in a book or a textbook or photos, but you see how it actually is, and that how everybody's different. And remember, there's like 8 bodies in a room, and there's 32 students working on these bodies all at the same time. So we would hear, hey guys, check it out. And we'd see each other's bodies and see how they were all different. And seeing it, touching it, feeling it really does cement it in your mind.
Now today, doctors no longer have to rely on dubious methods of obtaining cadavers for study.
For the most part.
For the most part, as far as we know. But and the fact that, like, as you said before, there's actually a surplus of bodies being donated compared to in the past. Like, there's too many people who want their body to be donated to science. And that's just, like, so cool to see how the perception of the sciences and what it means to have your body dissected even means today.
I mean, completely honestly, I would donate my body to this. I would probably tell my family, please bring it back though, just in case.
Just in case. Just in case there's something we don't know about yet. Thank you so much, Christine, for sharing your experience with medical school. It's just so cool to, like, you know, be able to chat with somebody who has that, like, literal hands-on experience and can also, like, speak to how things have changed and how things still maybe need improvement in some ways. And where can we find you online?
On YouTube at Socine or Instagram at Socine. And thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really glad that you're talking about medical school history because it's so interesting.
So, yeah, shit was jacked and in some ways still is. But there's no question that now we are miles and miles better off than we used to be overall. I hope you've enjoyed this dive back once again into the world of Victorian and pre-Victorian medicine, or simply found it interesting. I always love visiting this topic, and I've been looking forward to getting more in depth on this specific thing that I've mentioned many times in my previous videos. So, don't forget to buy my graphic novel, Liberated, The Radical Art and Life of Claude Cahun, and until next time, wash thy hands, wear thy mask, and keep your bodies under lock and key.